So you're an edgelord, huh? Or maybe you just like goth mommies. In either case, you have decided to play the Necromancer, one of the all-around most beginner-friendly classes that easily scales into the hardest content available. With some upcoming changes to its healing build, this class has found itself yet again in the spotlight. Let's take a look at where this build, along with other builds in its primary roles, come in, along with what I recommend you play for the end of 2024 and into 2025. Let's start with the power DPS option, which for this class is the Power DPS Reaper. The Power DPS Reaper is an all-around fan favorite build, and it has a lot of survivability, good burst, an easy rotation, and it is incredibly selfish in terms of boon generation, which is not necessarily good for your team. It does bring everything it personally needs to a fight. For this build, you are going to be running full Berserker's gear, excluding an Assassin's headpiece with runes of the Dragon Hunter and Relic of the Firework. Your weapons are going to be Greatsword and Dagger Sword with Force and Accuracy sigils on both sets. Your food is going to be standard power food with sous vide steak and superior sharpening stones. The traits are going to be Spite 1-2-2, Soul Reaping 1-1-2, and Reaper 2-1-3. The standard skill loadout is going to be your Soul is Mine, Well of Darkness, Well of Suffering, You Are All Weaklings, and either Flesh Golem for fights with big break bars, or you can run Chilled to the Bone as an alternative. This is a fun skill. It doesn't really help your DPS, but it is a large area CC, and I mean, I like it, okay? So what? It's not as good as Lich Form. I like it. The rotation on this bad boy is real easy, like arguably one of the easiest meta rotations in the game, and I'm going to tell you how to make it even easier. First off, you want to start the rotation on Greatsword using Greatsword 5 and 4 into all of your utility skills before weapon swapping. You dip into Reaper Shroud and you use your auto attack chains in sets of 3, your skill 2, and your skill 4. You only use skill 5 right before exiting Shroud. On Dagger, your skills can all be spammed. Just make sure that you use 4 and 5 on Sword interchangeably. So don't use skill 4 and then wait for it to come off cooldown and use skill 4 again. Use like skill 4, skill 5, skill 4 again, and then skill 5 again. Dagger is really only here to help you top up on Life Force, and Life Siphon is a DPS increase. So blast all of those skills off, weapon swap again, back to Greatsword, and then back into Shroud. Chances are if you find your utility skills and your weapon skills on cooldown, you are going to go into Shroud and start pumping with skill 4, your skill 2, and auto attack chains. Realistically, the opener is where you primarily get your damage pumping, so make sure to maintain the combo of triggering Firework from Greatsword, Reaper skill 5, and using those utilities. There is a Condi variation of the Reaper, however it is significantly more complicated and frankly worse than the other Necro Condi DPS builds. Which, moving on to Condi DPS builds, we are going to take a look at Old Reliable, the Condi DPS Scourge. The Condi DPS Scourge has been the bane to ArenaNet's existence for a long time now, because frankly the class as a whole is really overloaded. Firebrand and Chronomancer have the same issue where it just does way too much. Loading this guy up with Condi DPS gear and setting it loose in fractals and raids literally define the meta for safe, effective clears for like 5 years. And guess what? It is still good. Does it have the highest benchmark? Absolutely not. But is it highly effective? Yes, it is. For the Condi DPS Scourge, you are going to run full Viper's gear with Runes of the Trapper and Relic of the Fractal. You are going to run Scepter Torch and Pistol main hand with Bursting on both main hand weapons and Torment on your offhand weapon. Your food is going to be Meaty Asparagus Skewers and Potent Master Tuning Crystals, and your traits are going to be Curses 2-1-3, Soul Reaping 1-1-3, and Scourge 2-2-2. Your skills required for this are going to be Sand Flare, Blood is Power, and Plague Lands, so you have 2 open slots. Though if you aren't in the race for top DPS, you can always swap out some of these for more support, Primarily, I'm talking about Plague Lands for Flesh Golem. But as a DPS player, you should try to always maximize your DPS. You do have 2 free slots, so things like Sand Swell, Spectral Graft, and Serpent Siphon are available, along with things like Signet of Undeath, which is helpful for life force generation and ranged reses. The loop is really easy to follow, being Scepter 3 and 2 with auto attack chains, and swapping to Pistol for skill 2 and 3 off cooldown, and then back to Scepter. You basically start with 2 casts of Scepter 3 and 2, and then 3 casts of skill 2 on Pistol with 2 casts of skill 3. In the meantime, between your weapon skills of those key abilities, you want to auto attack, focus on finishing your Scepter auto attack chain, casting Torch 4 and 5, and using Shade skills F2 and F5 off of cooldown. You always want to run a minimum of 1 Shade up at all times, and you cast Blood is Power immediately after or during your F5 cast to transfer the conditions of Blood is Power to your enemies. I'll talk a little bit about Blood is Power in a minute after we cover the builds immediately adjacent to this one, which is the condition Alacrity Scourge. This is one of the boon DPS options for the Necromancer, and it's no surprise that it plays identically to the Condi DPS Scourge. There are a few minor gear adjustments and trait adjustments, but for the gear you want to run full Ritualist armor with Runes of the Trapper, with the full Viper's Trinkets and Relic of the Fractal. The same weapons as the Condi Scourge, so Scepter, Torch, and Pistol, with Bursting on the main hand and Torment on the offhand. Your food is also going to be the same, with Meaty Asparagus Skewers and Potent Master Tuning Crystals. Your traits are going to be Curses 2-1-3, Soul Reaping 1-1-3, and Scourge 2-3-3. Your primary utilities are also going to be the same as Scourge, with Blood is Power, Sand Flare, and Plague Lands, and the rotation priority for your weapon skills is also identical. The way this build generates alacrity is through the application of Barrier, which you apply Barrier to your teammates through the summoning of Sand Shades, which is your F1. You should be doing this frequently to maintain at least 1 up at all times, just like the DPS Scourge, and then through the use of your F5 skill. You also give Barrier to allies through the use of Sand Flare, which is your healing skill. The trait adjustments that you can make are swapping your first Scourge condition trait from the second to the first slot, which should be done for either additional Condi cleanses or more might generation. The Scourge as a whole is extremely support heavy, so as an Alac provider, I personally lean even more into the support through swapping out Plague Lands for Flesh Golem, using Serpent Siphon and Signet of Undeath on my free utility slots. And no, before we move on, I haven't forgot about Blood is Power yet. I'll get around to it. First, we need to talk about the other boon DPS option that the Necromancer has, which is the condition Quickness Harbinger. The Condi Quickness Harbinger is a fast-paced support build which provides a ton of boons despite running full DPS gear. It uses full Viper's gear with Runes of Torment and Relic of the Fractal, with Pistol, Dagger, and Scepter Torch as your weapon sets, with Torment and Bursting on both sets. It is standard Condi food with Flatbread and Toxic Focusing Crystals, and the traits for this build are Curses 1-1-3, Soul Reaping 1-1-3, and Harbinger 3-2-2. Your skills are Elixir of Promise, Blood is Power, Elixir of Anguish, Signet of Spite, and Elixir of Ambition. Signet of Spite is your freebie, and you can use either Elixir of Risk, Elixir of Bliss, Spectral Grasp, or any other utility that you want in place of this skill. The way this build generates quickness is by being active in Harbinger Shroud, so you want to dip in and out of Shroud frequently to maintain boon uptimes. You build up Blight while in Shroud, and that interacts with your potions. Your potions also give you Blight, which you use them to hit your enemies, but it splashes on you and gives you that effect. And this is important because some of your skills have a Blight threshold, and the Blight threshold, if you meet it, will significantly increase the effectiveness of that skill. So managing the blight mechanic is the name of the game for DPS on this build. Your Shroud skill 3 and 4 are only worthwhile while above the blight threshold. In short, spam your elixirs on the Scepter set, use skill 3 and 2 along with your torch skills, swap before you go into Shroud. In Shroud, use skill 4, 3, and 2, ensuring that you are above the blight threshold. Out of Shroud, spam your elixirs, Blood is Power into Deadly Swarm, which is skill 4 and 5. Use Signet of Spite if you took it, weapon swap, and then back into Shroud. If you rinse and repeat this, you should do respectable damage and upkeep your primary boons. And now, before we get into the build that everyone has been waiting for, I want to take a second to talk about Blood is Power. Blood is Power is a core skill used by Condi builds on Necro. Even the Condi Reaper uses it, and it functions by inflicting self conditions, and then you want to transfer them to enemies for a DPS increase. It is a good amount of DPS, and it should be a priority to incorporate this into rotations. With Condi Scourge and Alac Scourge, this is done through your F5 ability pseudo-automatically. For Harbinger, it is done through Dagger 4, and herein lies the problem. Oftentimes, in groups, you will use Blood is Power and immediately get cleansed by some passive Lights Field Blast, a Chrono Shatter, or another Scourge's F2 ability. This skill is used in rotation videos to highlight the maximum DPS, and it is a valuable part of might generation for supportive builds like these. However, if you do find yourself not being able to transfer these conditions and they get cleansed, oh well, it is what it is. It's still valuable for the might generation for your subgroup. And if you start playing these builds, you will definitely get a feel for when you can effectively transfer the Condis with Scourge if you precast at F5 as you are casting Blood is Power, but the Harbinger is a little less reliable. Moving on to the build we have all been waiting for, the healing option for Necromancer, the Heal Alacrity Scourge. The Heal Alacrity Scourge has been one of the most broken builds for a long time, and I'm talking years and years. And while it wasn't always the most useful in fractals, the community at large has finally adopted it as a hard carry that it was, and frankly, it was pretty on brand for Necro. Instead of reviving skeletons and minions from the dead, you just infinitely revived your team members. That was the whole gimmick. You should use transfusion to pull your allies in, mass revive them using res modifiers on like Well as Blood and revival traits and transfusion, and then you carried on with the fight. And I will warn you now, transfusion is being nerfed. I still believe this build will function and it will be better than some of the other off-meta healers, and it does have a large amount of revive potential and poops out barrier for your squad, so I can still see this build being effective even after the transfusion nerf does come into effect. Everyone is dooming like this is the end of an entire build. It is not. I know some people that love this build, and that's because it's broken. People loved broken Necromancer bleed minion spam too, where you summoned like 8,000 bone fiends. I get the build is fun, and fun builds sometimes get nerfed, and if you are really beat up about it, you can take a seat next to all of the Bladestorns and all of the Elementalist players and just hug it out with those guys. But the Heal Alacrity Scourge runs full Harriers or full Minstrel's gear or Givers or any variety of the three, and Relic of Phoebe. This relic is optional. This is here for swiftness generation, which the build lacks. So keep that in mind. If you have another relic that you want to run instead of this one, you can run that one. Your weapons are going to be Dagger Torch and Pistol Warhorn with concentration and transference on both sets, and you are going to rock classic heal food with Fruit Salad and Bountiful Maintenance Oil or Rice Balls. Your traits are going to be Blood Magic 113, Soul Reaping 131, and Scourge 133. Your primary skills are going to be Well of Blood, Desecrate, and Flesh Golem with 2 open slots. I'd heavily suggest Signet of Undeath in one of those 2, and for the last one, you can run Serpent Siphon, Spectral Grasp, Sand Swell, or Trail of Anguish. they're all good options. And to play this build, you literally just spam your shades, F1 through F5. It's literally the easiest build in the world. You just spam your Desecrate and your Torch 5 off cooldown. Your CC is your F4, Pistol 3, and Warhorn 4, along with Flesh Golem. Your F4 can be saved, but you generate your Alacrity through granting barrier, so casting your Sand Shades, which is your F1, about every 5-6 seconds, and casting your F2, F3, and F5 off cooldown. And then you just wait for your sorry, hopeless allies to die and need revival, and then you can pop your F4 to pull them in and revive them. But that's coming to an end, so don't rely on that. You could just spam your F4 along with everything else. Unless you are doing some high level content, you won't need to wait to cast it. And before I close things out, I do want to recommend an open world build, which I forgot to do on Guardian, but many people love playing Necro, and I think it is one of the higher played open world classes. I recommend running a modified Power Reaper build for the open world. Primarily, I would run Relic of Zakharos instead of Fireworks, and taking Chilled to the Bone as your elite instead of Flesh Golem. This build, even in full glass cannon gear, is really strong in the open world. You can easily melt elite mobs and survive most fights due to just the Necro's high health pool and second health bar with Reaper Shroud. Just something to consider. There are other good relics besides Zakharos, so if you don't want Zakharos and you don't have it, feel free to play around with it and try out different ones. To be honest, even just running Firework and making no adjustments to the build yields pretty good results. So keep the traits and gear the same and play around with the relic. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. A special thanks to all of my subscribers. If you dig the content, please consider subscribing. Thanks again, and I will catch you on the next one. Peace.